Right then, what we're going to be looking at this time is something I promised a few videos back when we were looking at SignalR, and we created a rock, paper, scissors game that used a SignalR hub written in ASP.NET, but was consumed by just a website that was an MVC website using plain old JavaScript. But what we're going to do now, we're going to have the same hub on the server, but we're going to consume it in Angular, and that's going to involve using observables and things like that. So bringing together quite a few ideas we've seen recently. Let's just have a quick recap of what we're going to put together. So what we would have here, we would open up a couple of windows so we can see one there and another tab there. And then we could enter the names. So we could go for Barney in one of them, it's waiting for the player. We go for Betty in the other, and then they can play rock, paper, scissors. So we can make a selection there, and we get the result. So that's all that we had beforehand. Now, obviously, the bit of it we're seeing here, I'm actually going to be replacing with the Angular application. So we could have removed this basic front end completely, but might as well leave it in. But essentially, we could have stripped down the server to just being the SignalR hub and not concern ourselves there with any of the actual front end stuff at all. There is one slight change I've had to make here, however, and that is on the server, I have added a CORS policy. So you may remember from an earlier video the idea of CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. When you have a web server that's being contacted through JavaScript directly from the website it's generated, you don't need to worry about this. But what we're going to do now, we're going to have a different Angular website connecting back to this server, and we've got to allow that, and we do that by adding a CORS policy. And you see, I've been very relaxed about this. We should probably be a bit more security concerned, but I've said allow any origin, but that just means it'll work. But apart from that, it's exactly what we saw in the earlier video, and we had our game hub, which is where the real logic of the game was going about. So let's move on and now start looking at what we're going to have in Angular. So I've got an application that I've put together a fair bit of, so we don't have to write too much code. And again, if we look at the browser, we'll see I've got two tabs open, but in this case, because I've not filled anything in, they're simply both saying waiting for server connection. So let's have a look at the code in there. And basically, it's all handled by this thing called my game manager component. And you can see in the game manager, we are looking to see if we've got this observable called status dollar, and in fact we haven't, and so that's why it's currently just displaying that waiting for server connection. And then once we've got the connection, we have here an ng switch on this thing called status, and then we've just got these three possible statuses of connected, waiting, and playing. And if we're connected, we display this app welcome, which is here where we have the enter your name so you can register and begin a game. And then we also have this just waiting for another player to connect. So when Barney's connected, Betty hasn't, we display that one. And then finally, probably the one with most of the work in it, we have this app playing, which is where we have the actual logic of the game that we've got in there. And you can see we've got the buttons to click for whether you go rock, paper or scissors, the output, and that sort of thing. But none of it really working at the moment because we've got to add the connection to SignalR. And then also I've got this service, and this is where the real business of this is going to go along. So we've got this hub connection service, and not very much in there at the moment. It's just got these couple of observables that are not being properly hooked up yet, and we'll see what happens with those in a moment. And then that's being injected into things like the game manager and also into the playing component so that they can make use of it. So let's start filling that in. And the very first thing we've got to do is actually we've got to get hold of another library. Now I've mentioned that SignalR is a layer on top of WebSockets, and one of the things it manages for us is the things like the connection and the groups particularly that we were talking about earlier. And the way it makes that all work is actually when you're connecting to a SignalR hub, the very first thing you do is you make an HTTP request to establish your connection, and then you use the WebSockets to actually maintain the communication. And in the SignalR library, the JavaScript library that we used last time, that's all hidden away for us. We could have done that manually here in the Angular, but there's actually a third-party library available to do that. And if we just take a look at that, if we just go here, we can see it's this thing called NGX SignalR WebSocket. So this is a fairly recent library, only been out for 3 months, but this will make our life a lot easier. And if we want to get hold of it, there you can see the command. So let's just copy that. And then let's go back to our VS Code and paste that in, and that will install this new package. Okay, so that took a little while. We've got ahead, and now we can see what we can do with that. So let's go to this hub connection service and start making use of the package that we've just added. And so if we go down to the constructor here, and the thing I want to do first here is create our client. So I'm going to call this client and then say equals SignalR client. So that is one of the packages we just got through from this new library. And then on that, we say dot create. And then actually, you can see that to create the SignalR connection, we need an HTTP client. And as we've seen on earlier videos, that's just something we can inject. So in here, we'll just add to the constructor the HTTP client, and that will bring it in. And then we pass that into there. So that's created our client. But now we need to make our connection to the server, and this is really the bit that does that hidden HTTP request to initialize our connection. So we say client dot and then connect, and then we need to give it the URL. Well, I've already defined that. If we look in environment dot, there I've got my game hub URI, and if we just take a look at that, you can see it's just set up for that local host, which is where the other one is running. So that will make our connection, but that connect does itself return an observable. So almost immediately we're in the realm of observables. So I'm going to subscribe to that observable, and it will give me back a connection. And we'll see that this connection is of type SignalR connection. So what I'm now going to do is make that a member of the class. So I'm going to have a private, and then we'll just call this connection. It's going to be uninitialized to start with, so we'll put a question mark on that. And then the type is SignalR connection. So that is what we're going to have. And then down here, we can just in here say this dot connection equals connection, the one that's come in to the subscribe. So that has hooked us up, and we're now ready to go and do the communication. Now remember, with SignalR, with WebSockets, what you have is two-way communication. So we're going to have messages coming from the server, but the simpler part of it is actually the messages we send out to the server. So let's hook those up straight away, because if you look down here, you'll see that we already have these stub functions for register and for throw. And remember, if we go back and look at our hub in C#, those were the two things we did. So register is where we say, I want to play, my name's Barney or whatever. And then throw is where we say the particular player is making a particular selection, rock, paper or scissors. And in the Angular, I've already hooked those up, so we can see on our welcome component, they can register with their name by calling that hub register. That's the stub I was just showing you. And on the playing component, you can see they can do a throw, sending in a particular selection. So if we just go back here, we're going to hook those up. And this really is the simplest part of it, because all we need to do is in here, we're going to say this dot connection. And then remember, it might not be defined, so put a question mark. And then we simply say dot send. And then the name of the method. So this is register. And then the parameter. And remember, again, if we look at the C#, the parameter for register was just that name. So we can pass that through there. So sending messages from the client to the hub is as simple as that. And similarly on the throw, we're going to say this dot connection question mark dot send. And then this one, remember, is called throw. And the parameters we need to send that are the group, which we can see is coming in there. So that's the pairing of people in a particular game is the group. And then we're going to have the player name. So we've got this dot player name that you'll notice we just stored up there when they registered. And then finally, we're going to actually send the selection, which again, we've got coming in. And we can see is a string that's either rock or paper or scissors. So that will hook those together. Not actually going to be able to call those yet, because remember, at the moment, we're just stuck on the waiting for server connection because we haven't really quite done enough. But now we've got that connection there, then we can send our messages to the server and that will have that working. Now we've got to start responding to things coming out of the hub. And remember, if you look at the hub, we've got a number of messages coming out. We have the waiting for player when one player's registered and another hasn't. We have the game started when they've both registered. And then when the game is playing, we can say pending when one person has made a selection, the other one hasn't. And then the result can either be drawn or won. And you'll see, actually, it's quite neat even here. We could divide those messages into two different groups. We've got the messages that are going to happen while the game's actually being played. And then we've got the messages that take us through the startup procedure. And the way we're going to put this together in our Angular is actually to turn those groups of messages, those two groups of messages, into two separate observables. So the multiple messages get streamed together into these two observables. And we'll start with the one to do with registration, so the game started and waiting for players. So if we go back to our VS Code, and then in here you can see that I already declared, though I haven't actually hooked it up yet, this status. And this status is an observable of a type I've predefined called game status. And so there you can see this game status has the three phases we go through. We're connected to the server, we're then waiting for another player to come along, and then playing is when we've got both players. And you can see there's also some optional additional information, such as who the two players are, which player is us rather than the other player, and what group we're in. And those are all optional because they're going to be filled up as we go along. So let's see how we put that together. So the first thing we've got to do is we've got to create observables listening to those two possible messages, the game started and the waiting for players. So let's do that in here. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a private method, and I'm going to call this setup status pipe. And this is going to take as a parameter what we'll call connection, which is going to be of type SignalR connection that we just saw there. It's going to return void, and we're going to call that from down here in the constructor as soon as the connection's made. So I'll say this dot setup status pipe, passing in that connection. Then in here, we're firstly going to set up observables to listen to those two messages that we had, the game started and the waiting for players. So the way that we do that is I'm going to say let waiting for player $, so that's going to be my observable for that, and then we say equals connection dot on, and then we have a generic for the parameters that are coming through with that. And you'll notice on the waiting for player, we're not sending any additional parameters. So in there, we just put in an empty array because however many the word would come in as an array, so not going to be anything there at all. And then all we need to do with that is we put in the name of the message we're waiting for, which is waiting for player. And then I need to convert that into one of these game statuses. So I'm going to say pipe, and I'm going to say map. No data coming in because we have no parameters, as we said. And then I'm simply going to create an object of this type game status. And I'm going to say that the status is just waiting. So that's set up that one. And then I'm going to do something very similar to create the one that listens for game started. So this one I'm going to call game started $. And I'm going to wait for game started. But remember, game started sends us three parameters, the two player names and the group name. So what we have to do there is in this array, we just say string, 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 because all three of them are strings, so that's easy enough. But that means that when we now do our map down here, we can actually map that as an array that goes player 1, player 2, and group. So those will be the three parameters coming in. And then when we get that, we're going to have a status of playing, and then remember what that game status has. It has also the this player, the player 1, and the player 2. So we can put those in there as well. So we'll say this player is going to be this dot player name. So we already know the name of the player. And we'll also then just have player 1, player 2, and group. And because the names of those parameters coming in are the same as the names of the properties within that game status, then we don't need to label them. It'll just hook up automatically. So that has now created the second one of those. But now the thing that we need to do that's most important is we need to take those two different possible inputs coming from the server, and we want to merge them into a single observable, because that's what this status dollar is. And so if I do that, I will now say this dot status dollar, and we use the operation that we saw in an earlier video. We do the merge, and what that's going to do is take the inputs from these two observables, and just in whatever different order they come in, it will send them through into the one observable. So we're going to merge, and then we're going to merge the waiting for player with the game started. And now we can make it so that status is picked up in the game manager, and I can simply say that the property for status there will have this.hub.status there, and that's what I've just created over here. Now if we save all that and have a look back at the browser, you'd think that should now at least have got us through to the connected position. But there's one other thing that I've failed to do there, because remember, if we look at the stages we're going through here, we have connected and waiting and playing. If we look at what we've done in here, I've only done a waiting and a playing, because the connected isn't a message we actually get back from the server. It's just something that happens as soon as we make the connection. And so the way we can sneak that is to use rather a useful little operator. So I'm on this waiting for player, I'm going to do a pipe, and then I'm going to use an operator called start with. And so this allows us to insert an extra value at the beginning of an observable. So before we get the waiting or the playing, I'm going to just shove in there something with a status, which is going to be connected. And so if we look at the marble diagram for that, you can see we've got the observable originally just had the waiting and then the playing, and then by doing the start with, we can put the connected on the front of that as well. So now if we save that one, we should now see that on both of these, we're now at least getting to the welcome screen. And if now I pass in my Barney, we can see it moves on, waiting for another player to connect, because we've now hit the waiting for player. And then if on the other player, we put in Betty there and enter that, you can see both of them have now moved on to the playing. So that has taken the various possible statuses, the connected, the waiting, the playing, pipe them through into a single observable, and that's now allowing us to process the whole thing. But obviously the rest of it, the clicking the buttons, that's not yet really working because we haven't hooked that up. It is sending the message over to the server because remember we've already hooked up that button, but we're not responding to those messages. And we respond to them really in exactly the same way that we did as with these other ones. So I'm going to put in another one of these methods. So I'm going to have private, and this I'm going to call setup outcome pipe. And again, this one is going to take our SignalR connection and return void. Then I've got to take the three possible playing messages, pending, drawn, and won, and do the same sort of thing with them. I've got to merge them into a single stream. So let's have a go at that. And ultimately, what I need to do is produce this outcome, which is an observable of this structure where we have a type, and then we have pending or drawn or won. And again, if you look at these, I've got these predefined. So pending just says who we're waiting for. If you're waiting for Betty, you're waiting for Barney. Then drawn, we have the explanation and the scores, and won, we have the winner and the explanation of the scores. And the explanation just says rock, beat, scissors, or whatever it may be. So that's what we need to hook up on this outcome. So again, we're going to start out by getting hold of the three, in this case, basic messages. Again, we can do it with a bit of copy and paste. So this one I'm going to call just pending. We're going to be waiting for a message called pending. And pending just takes the one string parameter, and that, remember, is who we're waiting for. So who it is hasn't yet played. So parameter is going to be waiting for, that's our single string. And then what we have to return is simply that waiting for. And that isn't actually a game status, that is going to be as, and then this pending. So that's the first one of those. Then the second one we've got to do is going to be the drawn one. So we'll have a drawn. Now the drawn, remember, takes the two parameters, which were the explanation and the scores. So we'll have that in there. That's going to respond to drawn. So the parameters here we call explanation and scores. And that's going to have another of these messages, this time called drawn. So we change that to that. And then in here, we just pass in explanation and scores, because those are the two things we have in drawn. Again, the fact we've made the parameter name the same as the property name, that works fine. And the third one is going to be pretty straightforward. So this one we're going to call one. And so we're going to be responding to the one message. And remember, that takes three strings, the winner, the explanation, and the scores. So we'll put that in there as winner, explanation, and scores. Change that one to 1, which is now that one we've got there. And so simple enough, winner and explanation and scores all going there. So that's our three separate observables for the three separate messages. Once again, we need to merge them into a single observable that is going to pipe each one through as the game progresses. And that's our outcome. So the last thing we're going to do is we'll say this dot outcome dollar equals merge. And then the one last thing we've got to do, remember that what this outcome has is, additionally to this thing called value, which is either going to be the pending or the drawn or the one, it has a string to say which one of those it is. This is what's sometimes called a discriminated union, where we've got three different types of information and we explain which type it is by having this additional type thing. So that means on our merge, we've got to do a little bit of work on each of those. So we're going to merge pending, but we're going to have to do a pipe on that and then a map. And then that's going to take in our value, which is either pending or drawn or one. And then we're just going to have to hook that together. So the type in this case is going to be pending. And then the value is just going to be value. And then we will copy that and paste it in 3 times for the 3 we're trying to merge. So the next one is going to be drawn, and I can simply paste that in there. And then the final one is going to be 1. So I can paste that in there, and that has our outcome now working correctly. So it takes the 3 possible ones, merges it all together, and sets up the final outcome. And once again, all we've got to do is down here in the constructor, we're also going to say this dot setup outcome pipe, and again pass the connection in there. And then the last thing we should have to do is just hook that up in the playing component itself. So you can see here in the playing component that I've already written some methods to respond to those 3 possibilities. So when we've got the pending, we just send out this output. And if we look at the output, we can see it's defined up here. It just has 2 possible lines of information and then the scores. And if we look at that there, we can just see those are just paragraphs that are going to display that information. And when we have a pending, we don't have any scores. We just need to fill in line 1 of the information. When we have a drawn, we just say it's a draw in line 1, give the explanation in line 2, and then we give it the scores. And if it's 1, we either say you won or whoever the other player is won, and then the explanation and the scores. So all we need to do is hook those up to respond to what we've just had coming through from this hub observable. So let's do that. So I'm going to do this directly in the declaration of this output dollar. So we're going to say equals, and then this dot hub, which we can see we've got injected in the constructor, dot outcome dollar. That may be null, technically, although the way this is designed, it can't happen. So I'll just put an exclamation mark on there. And then what we're going to do is a pipe on that. and then we're going to say map and what we call the outcome. And that outcome, bear in mind, is what we've just been setting up, so we can see it's either going to be the pending object, the drawn object, or the won object. And so if we then do a switch on that, so we can do a switch on outcome.type, and then our three possible cases are going to be pending and drawn and won. So we'll start with pending. All we do is return, and then that method I was just showing you, so this dot process pending, passing in the outcome dot value. So remember that outcome has the type to tell us which type it is, and then the value, which is either the pending object or the drawn object or the won object. Obviously it doesn't know what that is, so we've just got to do a typecast there, so as pending on that one. And then once again we can do some copy and paste. So we've got the pending, we've got the drawn, and we've got the won. So that's going to become process drawn with drawn in there, and process won with won in there, and that's all happy. And then one slight problem, we have to have a default, because at the moment conceivably not every case is covered, so we'll just put a default, and if it's not one of those we know something's gone wrong, so we'll just put in there a throw and then unexpected result. Not that it should ever get there, but we're just going to have something there for consistency. So you can see what's happening. The hub gives us back this outcome, and then we map the outcome, still in an observable, onto one of these output objects that is going to have the various values in there. So that should then be hooked up, because we can see that our output is already connected using the async pipe and hooking up line 1, line 2 and scores. So let's do a control KS, save all that, let it rebuild. And now if we go to the browser, we'll have Barney in there, and then we'll have Betty in there. And then if Betty plays rock, we're waiting for Barney. So back here, your opponent is chosen, we choose paper, and we get the result. So all working in a very, very similar way to what we had before. Now, I think you'd agree that the Angular version is rather more complicated than the plain old JavaScript version with MVC. If we just go back to that and take a look at the JavaScript that was actually required for this in our game.js, it was a lot simpler. And this is an issue you always get when you're trying to explain and do training about something like Angular, because in the really simple cases, which is essentially what we've got here, it's a lot of overkill. But when you get to much more complicated, larger websites, then the structure that we have with Angular and using the observables makes them much more extensible. So in this simple case, it may not be the best solution, but in the bigger picture, it probably will be. And then the last thing just to look at on that, the nice thing about it is, because I left the MVC version there as well, if I just refresh that, close that one, refresh that one, and close that one, we can actually play with the two different clients. So we can, on the left, you can see we've got the one that's just using the MVC and the plain old JavaScript. And then on the right, we've got the one that I've just written. So if I put in Barney there and then put in Betty here, you can see that now it really doesn't matter what the client is. We could have had all sorts of different implementations in the client. Could have another one done in React, another one done in Blazor, something like that. But they're still working together, so I can click paper there, waiting for Betty, click scissors there, scissors beats paper. So it's now very, very flexible. We've got the SignalR hub, but a whole diversity of different possible clients. So that was really putting the final level on this, having a different client on our SignalR hub. What we're going to be looking at in the near future is we're going to be looking at Blazor, which is again another Microsoft technology, but one that in certain configurations relies on SignalR, and in fact is another layer on top of the game. So we'll be looking at that maybe in the next video or one soon after that. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to schedule them. But if you enjoyed this one, do subscribe, do click like, and I'll see you next time.